Occasionally, I'm really happy to see a video getting through to an actual topic. And this one is one of those. It's what happens if after 1982 the Royal Navy goes Stanflex as a methodology and a system. And to be honest, this question about Stanflex has been being asked so often, so many times by Lions for so long on the channel that I've been silently rooting it almost every time there's been a patron vote. And the fact it's made it through to a video, I'm very happy for. Because it's also quite a cool topic. Because one of the interesting things we're going to be talking about, and basically we're going to look at the 1982 scenario and what lessons were drawn from the Falklands War and what happens to the Royal Navy and how they implement those lessons. Basically why they didn't go Stanflex first, and then we're going to look at what happens if they would have gone Stanflex. Because one of the interesting things about Stanflex is it actually starts development around about the same time as the Falklands War. And its criteria does fit a lot of the criteria which come out of the Falklands War for the Royal Navy. Now, what am I talking about in terms of criteria for the Falklands War? Well, the big lesson for the Royal Navy was that their ships needed to be upgradable. They had tried upgrading the Leander class. The Leander class had gone through various upgrades. These had been the light frigates in the Royal Navy, and the vast majority of light frigates in the Royal Navy prior to the Type 23s, etc., coming into service. And the Leander class were good ASW ships, but modernising them had been problematic. Most of them had lost their 4.5-inch guns. As part of modernisation, some had gained Seawolf and Exocet. Some had gained extra Seacat launchers. Some had gained Ikra with that extra Seacat. Some had gained Exocet with that extra Seacat. They'd all lost their 4.5-inch guns. And when you look at the class and you look at the effort that's put into it, it's a level of modernisation, yes. But all these programs have been kind of difficult. A, they'd been compromises on the ship. And B, they'd been difficult to do. They'd been expensive. And the Royal Navy was worried. The Falklands War had been a bad experience in many ways for the Royal Navy. They had grown quite comfortable in their Cold War, anti-submarine warfare, northern sort of northern sea, North Sea, North Atlantic supporting role. They'd lost their carriers. They'd lost much of their feelings of being a great navy, but they still felt a very great professional navy on that level. And they felt they were doing a good job. And the Falklands War showed them, A, they'd made the wrong bet on their radars. B, they hadn't modernised their air defence systems. In fact, a lot of them were frankly useless and deadweight they were carrying with them. And C, they needed to do a lot of work on their ships. And the upgrades and factoring they'd been doing had been too expensive, and they hadn't been able to get through enough of them. They hadn't been able to do the upgrades they wanted to do. And that's a problem. For the Royal Navy, there are a variety of lessons beyond this which come out of the Falklands War, but realistically, when we're talking about Stanflex, we have to look at the scenario that faces us with the escort force. And that had been bad. If you look at the Royal Navy's losses in the Falklands War, they'd overwhelmingly happened towards the end of May. Well, Arden, Antelope and Coventry are lost 21st, 23rd/24th in the case of Antelope, and Coventry on the 25th of May. And again, Arden and Antelope are two Amazon-class light frigates. They're Type 21 light frigates. And to be honest, the Type 42s aren't exactly considered heavy destroyers. The Royal Navy had been building the Type 82. The Type 82 had been not just part of the CVA-1 project, it had been part of the Royal Navy's effort to have a decent picket destroyer, a decent principal destroyer to build its air defence around. And it had only been allowed one of those, and then forced to build its air defence force, an air defence structure realistically around the Type 42s, which were a lighter, cheaper destroyer design. Also look at its other losses. Its other losses include, of course, the Atlantic Conveyor. They didn't really have anything they could apply to merchant ships. Sagala had a logistics ship. Again, something which they probably needed to be able to arm up. And these ships had all had value. And they hadn't been able to arm them. They hadn't been able to keep them armed. And the troubles with RFAs, etc., is how do you keep them armed? That you don't want necessarily, especially in peacetime, them to be armed and to have to maintain weapons aboard them and systems. But how do you quickly arm them up in wartime? This was the discussion of a lot of naval officers after the Falklands War. There was a lot of interesting discussion going on, and they looked at all the various systems going around. Now, the way they went was built-in weapon systems. Things like the close-in weapon system and Phalanx, etc., built in. But there was another option out there. The other option being discussed is Stanflex. Now, Stanflex is basically Legoization of naval weaponry. Sorry, I'm not sure what happened there. Legoization of naval weaponry. It is. It's plug and play. We are going to make a standardized slot on our ships, and we're going to have a range of different, let's be honest, cubes that can fit in those slots. And they're going to come with a range of different capabilities. So we can transform ships with a crane which can lift roughly 15 tons. If you have a 30-ton crane, you can move it really quickly. 15-ton crane is all you need, but if you have a 30-ton crane, you can do all sorts of fun things with that. Have an even bigger crane, it's going to really quickly. But basically, the idea was you would have a system which you could upgrade ashore. You could take the take the weapons out. You could upgrade them in a warehouse ashore, and then you could put them back on ships, and they could go on different ships. You can move them around the fleet. You can reconfigure a ship in a day. Literally, a ship could come in the morning, configured for oceanic research, and go out in the afternoon, configured to fight World War III. That was the idea about it. The idea was to make these things as straightforward as possible. It's also, in a way, to disconnect the cost of weapon systems from the ships. So you're buying the weapon systems as long as they fit on these in these systems, in these Stanflex boxes, cubes, and a range of other things that configure, a range of other systems that can, and that enables you to realistically respond to scenarios and adapt to scenarios, but it doesn't mean you have to put the cost on the ships. You're just building the ships with the standard command system and control system that integrate with these boxes, and then you have the slots. And basically, the bigger the ship, the more slots it has. And you can play around. And that is a system which can sound very strange, but it is a response to the same problem which the British are confronting after the Falklands War. How do you rapidly arm and maintain a current armament on your lighter forces? Because if you're building a larger ship, you have the space, you have generally the steel and structure that you can put your extra weapons on, or you're going to build it with sufficient weapons in the first place. But when it comes to your lighter forces, your auxiliaries, and your smaller frigates, and your patrol vessels, and your minesweepers, honestly, in peacetime, you don't really want to run the cost of having heavy armaments on them for the jobs they're going to do. But in wartime, you'd quite like to be able to rapidly upgrade them. And it's a challenge. It is a challenge to know what to do, how to do, and when to do it. The Stanflex options are also interesting. Each module, by the way, is built by Monberg and Folsom, which are now part of MT Hogard. It's 3 meters long, 3.5 meters wide, and 2.5 meters high. And they are designed and built, the systems, they're designed so they can only be put in one way. One of the reasons why they are 3 meters long, not 3 meters and 3 by 3 meters by 3 meters, is so that they literally can only be put in one way round. So the 3 meters and 3.5 meters, they can only slot in that way. Which means they are guaranteed to line up with the connectors and the systems. And if you go back to this picture, if you look very carefully, you can work out, where are the connections going to plug in? And so it plugs in automatically into the system. Now, as of a few years ago, the Danish were officially listed as having 100 modules of 11 different types. You're never quite sure with the Danish. There are times when they are very, very good at funding their forces, and there are times when they get a bit neglectful. There are times when they're investing long term, and they do have policies with their political parties that once you've agreed to fund something, you cannot then change it unless there is a major change in Parliament. Which is a good thing in many ways. It's a good thing. But it also means that parties which come in afterwards, they might choose, well, we can't not pay for this, but we can choose whether we pay for the things which are making it going to run, or pay for the maintenance, or pay for the broader investment, which is what leads to the issues with the Danish Navy. The Danish Navy is usually pretty good in terms of development and design, and their ideas of their ships. They count some really cool ships. Let's be honest, the Royal Navy's Type 31 is basically the Ivor Hoodfeld class. Modified and slightly increased. The thing that really annoys me about it is we've gone to the whole trouble of getting an Ivor Hoodfeld class design, basically modernized and modified, but yeah, and we took out Stanflex. We were literally buying the ship, which is the archetype for, this is the largest vessel, this is one of the larger types with Stanflex. This is a proper warship with Stanflex, which can change around. All those guns are mounted on Stanflex modules. We could literally have got a system where, okay, we can start building this capability up. And we could have moved it up to other designs and other systems. Because it would have been useful. Because let's consider the range of systems we're talking about. And I'm going to expand this out so you can see it properly. The range of systems. Because this is one of the fun things with Stanflex, is people sometimes go, oh, well, it's only going to be minor systems. So they're going, no, you can carry 2 quad Harpoon missile systems. I think I've heard discussions and ideas around them being upgraded to naval strike missiles. So they can each of those modules carries 8 Harpoons. So if you again look at the picture of the Ivor Hoodfeld, you'll notice she's carrying 16 Harpoon missiles. That's more anti-surface missiles than pretty much any Royal Navy warship is equipped with. More. Can carry, they have 20 which are armed with 6 cells Mark 48 Mod 3 launchers for RIM 7 Sea Sparrows. Okay, that's a fairly decent missile. It's longer range than a Seawolf, about parity with CAM. That's a pretty decent system, especially if it appears on the Sander. An Otter Breda 7662 compact gun. The module even comes with open size for ease of maintenance of the magazine. Well, that's quite useful. MU-90 impact torpedoes, triple launchers on that. Okay, that's not exactly bad for anti-submarine torpedo. It's a light torpedo. It's a Franco-Italian option, but it's still a good torpedo. You've got Thales Underwater's Salmon Variable Depth Active Passive Sonar System. Well, again, that's not bad. You've got command and control equipment for various mine hunting drones and systems like that. That's useful. You've got a version which is a hydraulic crane for launch recovery of ribs and or deployment of sea mines from external rails. Okay, I'm really liking this. You've got a version which can be used for below deck zone for storage and can carry a rib above deck. That's a flexible tool. Oceanography variant module, anti-pollution module, a survey module, and a signet enablement module, signals intelligent electronic intelligence module. That's quite a variety of a mixture. And that's quite a flexible addition to your force structure, if you think about it, because if your opponent's watching you, they're not going to be exactly sure what any ship is carrying, because they're reconfigurable. At the moment, this one has 2 of the Otter Breda 76mm on it. And then it's got 2 of the Harpoons and 2 of the Sea Sparrows, I think. But you could also, if you wanted to, load it up with 4 of the Sea Sparrows. And you could put 1 of the Harpoons forward and have 1 gun forward if you wanted. Or You can do all sorts of things if you want to. It might not be as menacing looking without 2 autobrader guns up front, but we're not in the game of menacing, we're in the game of war winning at that point. It's not a heavy frigate. We're not looking at something which is a Type 45 equivalent, or something which is supposed to, you know, even a Sandown Class equivalent. We're talking about something which is definitely in the comparison to the Type 23s of the world. That's not a bad configuration system. And yes, would I like a bigger gun? Of course I would, but the auto Breda gun fits in the slot. And it's not just ships like this which are affected. There's also the Absalon class, there's another Rasmussen class. There's all sorts of ships which the Danish build with them. They're on to, almost you could argue, their third generation of ships with these systems built in. And if you want to upgrade the weaponry, well, you can upgrade the weaponry without having to rebuild the ships. You just have to make sure it can fit on the cube. So, if you want to upgrade the weaponry and you've not got a new class coming in, it doesn't matter. You're not building a new class. You just get the boxes built. Do it in a warehouse. And then have a crane. And a software crane and a team with a USB drive, I'm presuming. Probably slightly more than a USB drive, but, you know, that's the scenarios you're talking about. It is a ship which can easily be reconfigurable within a day. That's a useful asset. You could have a vessel off doing oceanography, bring it in, reconfigure it to an ASW Hunter, to something which can defend itself. You could have a vessel off doing minesweeping and, let's be honest, with extra ribs and other systems on it, the usual maritime security taskings, and you could bring it in and go, right then, I want you to go minesweep in a higher threat area, so I'm going to fit you with, let's say, an Otto Breda, and I'm going to fit you with some SAMs. Doesn't sound like necessarily a bad option here. Then we consider when the Type 23 frigate procurement was. They're laid down in December 1985. They're launched in July 1987 and commissioned June 1919. That's HMS Norfolk. She is the original Type 23 frigate. And you look at her systems, and you look at what she's built as. She's not a bad ship. She isn't. And as built, they're armed with 32 Seawolf missiles for surface-to-air defense, 8 harpoons for anti-surface attack, and a 4.5-inch gun and a couple of 30mm. Plus, they have some Stingray torpedo tubes. A few machine guns, etc., added on for counterboat defense. And can carry a helicopter. All dressed up in a little over 4,900 tons. It's a good little ship. It's a capable ship. It's been the backbone of the Royal Navy for 40-odd years. Honestly, Norfolk is still in service with the Chileans as the Almirante Cochrane. And the oldest one in service in the Royal Navy, HMS Iron Duke, she was launched in March 1991, so she's 35 years old in naval terms. 35 years old. Still in active service. So these are critical. But let's be honest, most of them didn't receive an upgrade for a very, very long time. They didn't have naval strike. Most of them, it's shall we put in naval strike missiles or not? Shall we upgrade the Sea Scepter or not? It was always a thing of looking and going, well, they're only the light frigates and we're upgrading Seawolf. Now, the 4.5-inch gun is good, but also the rest of the ship, you have to agree, it was a little bit underarmed. For all the tasks they were asked to do, the Type 23s, as good as the crews made use of them, as good as ships as they were kind of underarmed for what they found themselves doing. They were designed to be light frigates, part of task forces, not to be as independently on their own as often as they were. And that's an issue. That is a real issue to think about, because the Type 23s are good ships. They are. But they could have been better. They could have been a lot better. And their concept as ASW hunters is true. There was actually ideas, I kid you not, when they were first being designed, of potentially building them with literally just a towed array sonar, and that's it. There were some that really bare-bone designs, and then they went, well, basically there were enough Falklands War veterans going, no! But even then, there were a fair number who were looking at them and going, these aren't the main ships for going into battle, right? You have the Type 22s, they're going to be working with them, and they're going, they're always going to have the more powerful ships around them, and then replacement for the Type 22s is going to be in, and those sort of things. Okay, and they're not going to be around for a long time. So, like frigates, they're not being built for long service lives. Yeah, that's all. That's all the case. They're going to be replaced on schedule. It's going to be fine. They're workhorses of the fleet. And when you start to put that in mind, you start to think about things like the Sandown Class MCMVs. HMS Bangor is the last of the class that serves the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy's been thinking about trying to work out what to do in terms of getting a mothership for its future, its mine warfare vessel, systems for a while. It's slowly getting rid of its MCMVs as they age out, as it doesn't want to operate them any longer, and wants to move towards a distributed containerized system that works from other ships. Well, where are the motherships? Where are the other ships? And one of the interesting things, if you start looking at some systems we're talking about, you would necessarily potentially have built a bigger vessel to begin with. You'd have potentially built something which was larger and more capable of doing this job from the beginning, in terms of being adapted. Because one of the things that's come in about the MCMVs for the Royal Navy is, well, most of them were designed when the Royal Navy was bigger and had more ships, more frigates, more destroyers, generally had more larger vessels available. So the idea was always, they'll be operating, if they're in a higher threat environment or a medium threat environment, they'll be operating under the protective umbrella of other warships. Again, I've done a video recently about what makes warships, why warships are getting bigger. Why ships are getting bigger than navies. And one of the reasons they are getting bigger is, as you have fewer ships, you expect the ships to do more and operate more often alone. And the more they're going to be operating alone, and more often they're going to be, the more they're expected to do, the more systems you want to build into them, which makes them bigger. And also the more you cram systems in, the more expensive it gets, because you're adding in, the systems are far more expensive than the hull and everything else. And literally, the Royal Navy and Britain and the British government, through lots of very correct decisions of, we're trying to save money, or, we don't need this anymore because look at the current situation. We're not looking further than 5, 6... We're talking about a 10-year building policy. We're actually not looking more than 6 or 7 months down the road in terms of threat analysis, and certainly not doing any risk analysis of long-term risks of the reality of an island nation. And therefore we can get rid of this because, mine warfare, that's certainly going out of fashion. And we have this offshore, we have this off-boat capability, this capability we can put on the ships and bolt on when we need it. So we don't need the actual special ships, we just need motherships for them. What happens if you don't have ships available to be motherships? These were actually de facto, and there are others, the Hunt class, were acting as the motherships. And now we're using HMS Stirling Castle, I think, in the role. And she's excellent, but she's also one ship. If you're going to use the capabilities from something like Stirling Castle, also, please note, HMS Stirling Castle is about 10 times the size of a Sandown class, and doesn't even come with the 30mm cannon which the Sandowns were fitted with, and is a converted merchant ship. A good vessel. She is a really good vessel, originally bought to provide some of the security for things like undersea data cables, etc. She's now doing the mine warfare support. She's now considered a mine countermeasures maritime automated systems ship. Not a bad ship. Originally bought for the Royal Fleet Auxiliary and now transferred to the Royal Navy. But still, it's kind of an issue when you think about how unarmed she is. And admittedly, she is literally barely converted from the merchant vessel she was beforehand. So, not saying if we'd had Stanflex, she'd have had slots built in for the Stanflex system, but it would have been an option. It would have been an option. Then we got the River Class OPVs. They're, especially the batch ones, their guns actually no longer, I think, certified for service soon. These would also have been a perfect option. In fact, one of the really interesting things is considering their size and capabilities, and if you'd gone with Stanflex, we'll talk about this in a bit, they might well have stepped into the mothership role. You might have actually ended up building more of these because they could have had the Stanflex modules put on them, and they could have carried three or four modules. Nothing unusual about that, and would have been even more flexible than they are currently. Some of the most overworked vessels in the Royal Navy are the River Class OPVs. They are currently Britain's face to the world. When ministers talk about Britain being around the world and ships being around the world, they mean mostly the Batch 2 River Class OPVs. And they are out there providing support for maritime security, and also, one of the things people forget about their forward presence, is they provide Britain with on-the-spot intelligence about what's going on in certain parts of the world. And that's useful. One of the things we've learnt in the 1990s and the 2000s is that you can only learn so much from up above. Satellite intelligence gathering only gives you so much detail. And sometimes you want to have a closer perspective. You want to have eyes on the scene. You want to have someone nearby who's got the appropriate signals intelligence masts, etc. and systems. Well, the River Class are useful. They're wandering around, they're making friends, they're providing assistance, exercising with allies in maritime security tasks, and they're providing Britain with not just presence, but also eyes in critical areas of the world. Eyes that are entirely British territory, and entirely dependent upon British wishes, where they are. As much as anything can be when it's forward deployed without enough fleet auxiliaries to sustain it, and operating it from, in some cases, a British base in Singapore. But it's a good facility, and they're good ships, and the crews are doing really, really well. Everything I hear about them is how well they're doing. But we're doing that with an OPV. An OPV which is not really that massively armed. And so this is the whole point. We've not gone down the Stanflex route. Why? We decided that the better option at the time when we were considering this and taking lessons of this particular war, was that we needed to build in the best weapons we could on the size of the vessel. We needed to give them a good fit from the beginning. Especially census fit. Census was deemed more important in many ways. And so the reason why we don't go Stanflex with the Type 23s, especially in things like that, is we go, Warren, we've got Seawolf. That's an excellent missile system. We know that's an excellent missile system. We'll load it out with them. We know Harpoon works. We know the 4.5-inch gun works because we need a deck gun to fire support. We know these things work. They're proven. So we'll slot them in. Boom, boom, boom. It's done. It's done. That's the ship good. We don't have to adopt any new systems. We don't have to do any arrangements with allies. We can do this, and we have the capability. And considering how they've lasted, you can't really argue with that. They made a decision. It wasn't a bad one. Was it the best decision? Well, that's what the whole discussion after the Shameless book plug is going to be about. But honestly, when I look at it, I can understand why they did what they did. And the real problems don't really show up, not in the Type 23s, but when you start to look lower. When you start to look down the classes and you start to look at what's happened, especially in the small numbers. Because frigates and destroyer numbers, they make headlines. You've possibly been hearing about them recently. They do, because big events require big ships, and big events and big ships make big headlines. But the smaller ships, well, one of the reasons why they're kept as underarmed as they are is because it's worried that they might, if they are too well armed, be used as justification for cutting frigate numbers, for cutting destroyer numbers. And sadly enough, I can see that argument. I can see that happening. But the reality is, for what they're being asked to do with the reduced frigate and destroyer numbers over recent years, the 1980s decisions about these things were not necessarily the right ones. And also, you have to remember, at this period in the 1980s, when they're making a decision, there's another factor as well. NFR 90 is taking place, and the Royal Navy is presuming that the moment they finish the Type 23s, they're going to start churning out 12 of these high-end air defence frigates of about 4.5 to 5,000 tons. Maybe as many as 5,500 tons. And so that's building into their analysis. And the Royal Navy in the 1980s when they're making decisions. We have the advantage of hindsight. We know what happens to NFR 90, we know what then happens to the Horizon project afterwards, and we know what happens to the Type 45s. They didn't when they're making decisions. And so you can understand their decision making. I can't really argue with it. But the video, as requested by Lions, as a premiere, as patron to the topic, was what happens if after 1982 the Royal Navy goes into Stanflex. And the fact that they did consider it, the fact that there were people who looked at it, means that there is that option. It is a very legitimate course they could have gone down. And because a Navy really did go into it, and we can see what happens with their ships, we do have a basis to draw from to look at the Royal Navy. And it's worthwhile looking at because of the discussions that it can bring about in terms of procurement now and for the future. Because there are ongoing discussions, and the thing about naval procurement is it's always an ongoing discussion, because there is always projects underfoot and consideration. Because the salt water of the sea never gives up. There is a ticking clock of every single ship all the time. You never get to stop and go, oh, fine, we got them in service, we can all take a break now. No, now it's planning their refits, their midlife upgrades, and it's already starting to look ahead as what are we going to need for their successor the moment a ship enters the water. With that being said, Shameless book club time. So this is the part where I ask you to like, share and subscribe and support the channel and help it grow. It's also the part where I remind you that when this video comes out, it could well be the last day of suggestions. I think it's last day of suggestions for June 2026. And tomorrow, when after this video goes out, when there should be a live Brew Ships, where I'll be chatting to you live, because I'll be in the middle of the Easter teaching and I'll be back from being away teaching basically for Easter, then the vote will begin for June 2026. And so I'll be really looking forward to seeing what you've suggested and seeing the topics that have come in over that week. I hope it's been a good load. I know there won't be a Stanflex one now because this topic's being done, but who knows what the topics that will come in will be. Always interested in them. Usually we get a nice mixture of historical questions, alternate history, and sometimes alternate future, or questions about current events. And as a rule, what happens, in fact, always happens, is pretty much is I take all the suggestions, I turn them into questions, stick them in a vote, then people vote, and the two with the most votes get made into lives and premieres. Eventually, and the two with which come 3 and 4 get made into Saturday premieres. So the top 4 get made into videos. Top 4 topics. I always look forward to see what they're going to be. Sometimes it's slightly worrying. Sometimes, like there's currently a video on the set. The Wayne Borean one, where there are books which I'm hoping will have arrived. They're supposed to have arrived with me by the time I get back from my teaching. If they haven't, then I'm possibly going to have to postpone it again, but hopefully I won't. Because it's an interesting topic, but the books haven't arrived. And I don't really want to do it just off internet sources and internet transcriptions of books. I want the actual books. And the trouble is, the 2 I've ordered don't have digital versions, so I can't even do digital versions of them. But anyway, thank you for your support. Thank you for making all this possible. Thank you for liking, sharing, subscribing, helping the channel grow, and all that stuff. Thank you for just being a great group of people. With that being said, let's now look at Stanflex. Now, this is a point which becomes kind of interesting. What happens if Stanflex becomes an Anglo-Danish project? Now, of course, I had to first go, well, let's hope the British don't muck it up. And actually, in this period, they probably wouldn't. If you consider how seriously they're taking things, especially after the Falklands War, they probably wouldn't. And a lot of their conclusions from the Falklands War are very similar to the conclusions the Danish have reached that caused them to make Stanflex, which is why they fit. One of the interesting points could be Sea Sparrow. Because in the same space you could probably fit and deal the weight of a 6-cell Sea Sparrow launcher, you could make an 8-cell Seawolf system. There was already works on lightweight Seawolf and various other systems like that the British were doing, so you could have done all sorts of things. You could have gone, well, maybe I go for a VLS Seawolf, maybe I go for a 6-cell, trainable launcher system. There are options. And Seawolf would be quite a good fit. Sea Sparrow is a longer range, and in some ways it's a little bit faster, but Seawolf is more maneuverable and is, well, I would say, depends again on the variant you're talking about. We're talking about the variants in the mid-1980s. Please note, I'm clarifying that because there are later variants of Sea Sparrow which are more maneuverable than later variants of Seawolf, and there are earlier variants of Sea Sparrow which are more maneuverable than Seawolf, but they're the ones in the mid-1980s that are roughly comparable. The Seawolf has a slight edge. It's always fun when you're starting to talk about missiles, especially when you're going with, we are using the publicly available information to discuss this stuff, because this channel is not in the business of being, I don't know, war funder. It's not. Even about systems which are no longer in service and you've heard information about, it's not war funder. So, yeah. But you could pack more of them. And that could be useful. That could be very useful. There's also, considering the British obsession of it, the likelihood at the time of a close-in weapon system variant. Now here's where things get really interesting, because when you're looking at the immediate post-Falklands era, the Royal Navy is actually looking at both the Dutch Goalkeeper and the Phalanx, and does install the Dutch Goalkeeper on several vessels. There is a scenario where I could see where a Dutch Goalkeeper system, which was preferred, could be joined in, and it could become a Anglo-Danish Dutch project with Stanflex. Now that does introduce some very, very interesting scenarios in terms of European defence cooperation, but also in terms of, you know, of how those navies approach this stuff. It does introduce some very interesting potential variants going on. I could see all the MCMV, the Signet, all those variants, the ASW, subtowed array sonar variant, that could all be put in. I still think when it comes to certain vessels, the Royal Navy will go for their big towed array fitted to the ship. But the options of fitting towed array to other things in the 1980s would have been really attractive when they're looking at the system. Really, really attractive, considering how focused on ASW warfare, that's anti-submarine warfare, the Royal Navy was. And you could have had Stingray instead of MU-90. Stingray's a perfectly good light torpedo. You know, again, the Danish would not go wrong with it, and the British wouldn't go wrong with it, and it would be a system to be putting on. In fact, there are lots of options here. You combine the two together, this becomes a very interesting, you know, concept that a lot of other nations might choose to get involved in. Because that's one of the big advantages once you get it being an Anglo-Danish project. When it's a Danish project, it's very much seen as an interesting thing the Danish are doing. But it's not really something which other navies do. You have the Royal Navy involved in it, and quite likelihood the Dutch Navy involved in it, and suddenly these things become something where a lot of other nations are going, ooh, is this a good idea? What is this for? And that starts to create almost an economy about it. Because if you have more nations building the cubes, more nations building the actual Stanflex systems, more nations looking at different systems to put in it, that again decreases the cost of fitting the systems to it, because it's pulled around more nations. It lowers down the cost. And suddenly, if, let's say, you're going, oh, well, I'd like to upgrade to Naval Strike Missile from Harpoon. Oh, good. That's lovely. Well, so would I, and so would I. Oh, so shall we set up a factory and churn out a few boxes? Yeah. Or a couple of factories? And it becomes almost like what the British do with their Trident missiles. We've considered what the British and Americans do with Trident missiles, where they're held in a common pool. The spares ones are. And you draw from them and you fill out your you fill out your SSBN. And you operate with those for a few years until the SSBN goes in for a long refit, and then those missiles get dropped back into the pool, and they're all maintained and etc. in the pool. It's potential you could have that being done with the Stanflex modules. There are some really interesting ideas for what could be done, and Britain getting involved early would mean probably the British would be quite heavily invested and quite heavily involved, which then has an impact for other things. Now, the first class which are going to feel that is going to be the Type 23s. They are. And that becomes quite an interesting thing to work about. What happens? What happens? Historically, this is what the Type 23s look like. Look at how much space their Harpoon missile launchers take up. The Type 23s, historically, and I am saying historically, have a beam at their maximum of 16 meters. So plenty of space for some 3.5 meter wide modules to be put in. In fact, forward, especially if you have 8 cells for Seawolf, etc., and the Harpoons, you could have 6 modules in that space that you could be designed for. Yes, it's not going to be exactly the same. The chip potentially is going to be slightly longer. You potentially add in a couple more module spaces back for torpedoes. So potentially you have an 8 module ship. Potentially, if Goalkeeper is also a module, you might go, well, let's stick a module up on the hangar, on the sort of up at hangar level. Maybe even a couple modules up there. They don't have to contain Goalkeeper to begin with. That's the thing. You could build her with spaces for these modules. You could build the slots. You could go, right, and we've got 6 slots, or we want 8 slots, or even we want 10 slots. Great. What are we filling them with? Well, at the moment we're going to fill them with ribs. We're going to have some boats there. We've got the towed array sonar. We've got the Seawolf and the harpoons all forward. But we're only going to put harpoons in one slot. We're going to put the other slot's going to be empty. We'll put in a blank cube. Or we could put in an extra Seawolf. You could end up with going, right, okay, so we've got 6 slots forward. We're filling 5 up with Seawolf, so we're going to take 40 Seawolf on this mission. Suddenly that becomes an option. Do you still want a 4.5-inch gun? I think, knowing the British, they did. The British would still want a 4.5-inch gun. But there is a scenario I can see where they're going, we wouldn't mind some of those 3-inch gun options, because we could add them onto ships when they're going to be doing things in areas where having like extra gun firepower is going to be useful. If you've got a vessel going on amphibious operations, especially if you've got, let's say, a gun position somewhere on equivalent sort of a hangar level, maybe it's on one side of the hangar level or something, you might go, well, if we stick a 3-inch gun up there, if we can do, again, you'd have to design it for these things. And again, the Type 23 frigate will be designed with this in, it's built in it from the DNA. Yeah, we're doing amphibious operations, we're supporting the amphibious unit. Having an extra gun might be useful. It gives us the ability to engage multiple land targets simultaneously. It gives us the ability to engage boats, etc., at certain ranges. You know, the 76-62 Compact is a pretty good versatile weapon system. And there's another option as well for a potential ally to get involved. That's the Italians. If you consider the closeness of the British, the French and the Italians at this time period, if the British are going down this line for the Type 23s and are working with the Dutch and Danish on these sort of systems, and are using already the Italian 3-inch gun, the Italians might well also be interested. I've already talked about other allies, but they are someone who really I could see getting involved. And the Type 23s, therefore, end up being even more flexible asset than they were historically. Yes, they'd be built and configured as a light frigate for ASW operations. But you would be able to go, okay, well, we don't really have surface threats in the Gulf. They're not really a heavy threat in terms of requiring harpoon anti-ship missiles to deal with. There's nothing that really requires that level of attention. But we have a lot of air threats in the Gulf. So instead of packing harpoon, what we're going to do is we're going to pack extra Seawolf, and we're going to take 48 Seawolf with us. And yeah, we're going to take some extra light guns with us. So maybe we've got goalkeepers on, maybe we add on the 3-inch guns or something on the mid systems. I don't know. There are options, and that's the point. This would give you options. And ultimately, the more powers, more nations which have got involved in the project, the better. Because it's going to give you even more options to pick from when you're making your boxes. And again, if you consider upgrading these ships is going to be, is it major structural work? No. Is it going to require dockyard time? Probably not. Not in a dry dock or anything like that. It's probably going to require a crane, and it's going to require some technicians to fit probably some other computer systems into the slots which are already provided for them. It makes upgrading a very sensible process for these ships to go through. It also makes it likely you're going to have more upgrades because you can do it more easily. You might even see Seawolf improved more than it was historically because, again, if more nations are buying into the Seawolf program, they're probably going to have more money to work on it. Which means Seawolf might get an extra couple of marks. And that could be very interesting. Now the thing is, once we get into MCVs and OPVs, then the world becomes very different. Because you start looking at going, well, automatically, oh, the difference between them is what modules we're fitting with them. So why are we building different ships? Why don't we build one class? One class to rule them all. And this is where it could be interesting. You could find the 76mm actually being implemented as the main gun. You might find them coming along with probably 2 forward and 2 or 3 systems aft. Maybe 2 systems aft, you know, something like that. The 2 systems forward would be for things like, well, normally they might be for a gun and they might be left blank, a storage slot. But they also might be configured for oceanography. They might be configured for Signet. They might be configured to provide themselves with some air defense capability, depending on where they're operating. And it means that you probably get into a process also if you're building, let's put it this way, you're probably looking at a commonality enough across the board from the nations involved, if you've got more than Denmark involved, building these sorts of vessels for their MCMV OPV role, that you do have some kind of joint project going on. And again, it's one of the areas where it's more easier to interact. And it starts to have impacts on the more nations that get involved. If more nations do get involved, and I honestly believe they would, because not because Britain's a really good salesman, or because Britain's uniquely leading the way or anything like that. No, the moment when you have Denmark doing it on its own, it's one nation. Once you have Denmark and Britain doing it, especially after the Falklands War, people are going to be looking at it more seriously. With the Dutch, the fact that they are so integrated, they are so connected to those navies anyway, and they work off the software with those navies. If those two have both gone that route, I can see them going it. And once you have those 3 nations all doing it, there are enough other connections going on. There's enough other projects at this point which are attempting to make joint projects work that I can see lots of things coming from it, especially as a Stanflex-based system makes it easier. Because what you're building is basically a configurable asset. So you're all going, well, basically we're all concentrating on building a Toyota Hilux. And we can choose what kind of special little creature we make our Hilux into. We can choose what weapon systems we do. It's entirely tailorable to our needs. If you consider the breakdown in the Horizon project for Britain with France and Italy was over radar systems and, believe it or not, VLS systems, the sheer quantity of VLS and other things that are carried. Well, if you're building in Stanflex capability, it's not a problem. If you consider the recent upgrades for the Type 45 program, etc., a lot of those things would not have been a problem under this sort of system. And for the OPVs, as said, you know, do we have separate oceanography ships? Do we have separate OPVs? Do we have separate minesweepers? Or do we have a pool of ships which can be configured to those roles? So they might be doing fishery protection, they might be doing maritime security, they might be doing oceanography. And suddenly that makes things a lot more efficient, and also for the navies operating them, but also means that for those navies, cost-wise, it makes it a lot more viable. Because they have one training pool. They have one type of ship they have to maintain and carry stores for, and so they can carry more stores for that one-time ship. It starts to work. It starts to work. Now, there are some consequences. It's not all going to be a bed of roses. The more people you have involved, the more points of comparison you're going to have, the more points of study you're going to have, the more points of consideration you're going to have. And that's going to lead to people going, okay, what are we doing? This is an Absalom class, by the way. Absalom class are basically the cross between a troop ship and a, well, frigate. Now, quite an interesting idea. Again, there's something you can do with the Stanflex system. You can make a very flexible asset. And again, you can see she can carry a lot of missiles. And is, again, loading up with 16 harpoons. The debates and discussions are going to cause problems. The more people you have involved, the more discussions you are going to get. But conversely, the consequences of the diplomacy that's going to go involved could actually end up suiting the Royal Navy. Suddenly the Stanflex system becomes a reason for the British government to be able to talk with its foreign counterparts and sort out other problems and talk on the world stage. That becomes useful for ministers. It gives the Defense Secretary a slightly higher profile in government. It gives them more reason to be talking to other nations and working with other nations outside of NATO. It gives, in terms of Royal Navy funding, the Royal Navy could present almost consistent funding, which, if you consider the fact that the Treasury doesn't allow you to keep funds when you underspend. What the Royal Navy could end up doing is basically asking every year for a certain amount of budget for Stanflex systems, for modules, and then place the order at the end of the financial year. So that money would basically be something they would keep hold of through the year to cover other emergencies if they had them, and then if they didn't have them, they order modules. And they could just keep ordering more modules, so they had a pool of modules. And no one could really argue them having a larger pool of modules. And they could always say, well, if we need to, we can sell some of the older ones off to allies who maybe are new to Stanflex and don't have the depth of modules we do. Or you could pay for modules to be upgraded, which could work quite well with Royal Navy funding. I know I've already mentioned that, but it's worthwhile emphasizing a system which works with funding. But again, that is something we know thanks to hindsight. The Royal Navy didn't realise funding was going to evolve quite so dramatically in the 1990s at this point. It didn't realise it was going to have to be chasing an entirely different scenario back in the 1980s when the decision was made. I'd say one of the problems you also will have with this is it will lead to a lot of discussions about whether you need weapons which aren't in the containers. So, if you're talking about larger missile systems, if you're talking about more complicated ships, suddenly they become almost more difficult to justify. Because they don't fit in the container system. They're not part of the containerized weapon system, the Stanflex modules, so, they can't have the pool of facilities that we need. They can't be pulled into it. They can't be easily procured in that methodology. And so you could have an ongoing procurement and ongoing production of ships which can take Stanflex, whether they're light frigates, whether they're OPVs, but you could have to have a real fight to justify anything bigger, anything more powerful, which is going to have systems which are built in, which is going to require heavier modules than can take Sea Sparrow or Seawolf or sort of things like that. Principally because once you get into the habit, it's going to be difficult to break. That might work quite well once you get to CAM, with all the options and variations of the Common Air Modular Missile System, aka C-Scepter, and the variants it can come in. But the in-between period, the late 1990s, early 2000s, could be a real issue. And that leads us to the Type 45s. NF-90 Horizon Type 45 program. Honestly, I think you end up with a ship which is probably still carrying the 48 cells. for Aster missiles. But I think potentially, instead of being fitted for, but not with Mark 41 VOS, they could be fitted with the space for, let's say, three of the containers behind the VLS system, and a couple forward. 3 of the Stanflex containers, and could be fitted with more spaces for them along the ship. You could end up with them having the capacity to, I don't know, have 9 containers fitted. Built in with 9 slots for containers. And that'd be really quite interesting, because depending on where you stuck a container aft, you could theoretically go, okay, so we're short frigates. Yeah, okay, we'll fit them with a variable depth sonar to our Type 45. It's not great, but it's better than nothing. Or, okay, so we're sending the Type 45 off for a presence mission. Okay, we're fitted with extra ribs because it needs to be able to spread out and do maritime security taskings. It's still got the air defense missiles, it's still got the 4.5-inch gun, it's still got those capabilities. It's part of the task group, okay, it needs to increase its air defense capabilities. Alright, so we fit it with Seawolf or Sea-Scepter modules. And you could load out with 5 of them, and let's say they each carry 8 Sea-Scepter missiles now. And the naval name for the cam, that is. No, I meant to mention that, but just going to clarify. Okay, so we're carrying 40 cam and 48 Aster missiles. Something that's an 88 missiles load. That's suddenly a very different air defense capability. We wouldn't be having the current discussions about capability insertion project. We'd just be going, yeah, they fitted some modules to them. I think the other scenario you'd see is because of the variability of the modules you'd fit, and knowing their extra power needs, you'd also potentially, with the Type 45s, have built in more power generation from the get-go, because they're an integrated electric propulsion system, an integrated, fully integrated power system, which might also have not erased but potentially mitigated some of the issues they've had with the WR-21s. It was more with the intercooler attached to the WR-21 than the WR-21, but still with their gas turbine engine system. Because they hadn't been designed for each other, and they don't really like each other. They've now been modified, and now they work better together. And you've added in extra with the PIP upgrade. You've changed it from 2 megawatt diesel generators to 3 megawatt diesel generators, which is again useful. But you could have originally fitted them with 4 if you wanted, or the 2 megawatt ones. And if you've got the ability to rapidly change containers and therefore potentially power needs on the ship, you might have done that from the get-go. And let's be honest, you've upgraded to 9 megawatts, but 8 megawatts of diesel power would have covered quite a lot of the issues. Not 100% erased it, or prevented it being a big problem, but it doesn't do that bad. And so I could see this becoming a really interesting thing in terms of the Royal Navy. And it would also be a case of, so we want to put naval strike missiles on, that's fine, have we got the modules? It wouldn't be... It's not a perfect plug-and-play system. There is always the need for doing some computer upgrades and tweaks and making sure it works with the command and control system. But it's doable. It's doable. And with the systems you're already building, it works. Now, the interesting thing is, you could also have gone, well, we're sending a Type 45 into an area where there's going to be potentially large numbers of drones. Okay. Let's say we fit in 24 Sea-Scepters and we add on a couple of 3-inch guns. One either side at the front. You could add in, more goalkeepers or whatever they're using if they did choose to go down the phalanx route eventually. There are options, and it's configurable rapidly to make a difference. Even now, when we're talking about installing Dragonfire, etc., you could have designed that to fit on a Stanflex module. It would definitely require you building stuff into the module which could support it power-wise. Not in terms of generation, but in terms of storage, etc. But again, you've got quite a large, if we go back and look at it, you've got quite a hefty space there. And if you consider already they designed the ones for the Otto Breda 76mm to be open so that you can inspect and maintain things in terms of magazines. So it's not impossible by any stretch of the imagination. Now, is this going to be a panacea for everything? No, it is going to create its own problems. I can see the arguments every year after they've been procured or ordered of whether we procure the right ones or not, and to an extent the arguments and debates over it, the flexibility of it is going to lead to its own debates. And that is going to be an issue. That is going to be something which is going to come up. It's going to be a case of, so you've taken Sea Scepters to put on a Type 45, that's left Type 23s without enough air defense missiles. What are you going to do about it? We're building modules as quickly as we can. Or we're reconfiguring Seawolf modules, the old Seawolf modules, as quickly as we can. It is not going to be something which is going to be easy. But it does give you options. And it's an intriguing thing, because if we consider America tried to copy the Stanflex system realistically for what they want to do for their LCS, but they tried to make it better in the American way. And I could understand where they're coming from. They wanted more flexibility, and they wanted more options from their modules, and they wanted more. Whereas the Danish, very much with the Stanflex, went, no, you have to fit these standards. This is what the cube is going to be. You can't adapt the cube, you can't change the power positions, you can't change any of the things. It has to fit this configuration to slot in these slots. More nations getting involved in that is going to lead to more debate along those lines of whether but ours is going to be special. But I think under those scenarios, what you possibly get is everyone going, well, yes, you can make yours special, but everyone else is standardizing theirs. And eventually, everyone goes down the route of, we've standardized. Ultimately, the scenario becomes, does America end up getting involved with their own LCS program? Do they make that their entrant? Do they actually join the Stanflex program? I doubt. I doubt it. But the interesting thing it would be an ongoing effort. It would be an ongoing scenario. And you wouldn't have things like people debating what weapon systems are going on to the frigates, etc. No, you'd be debating how many slots you're building a frigate with. Are you building a Type 31, your Type 26 with enough slots? Because the weapons procurement isn't really part of it. For anything like these ships, it isn't. Mark 41 VLS is going to be the only thing you're going to be installing which isn't in the Stanflex system. And it would literally be, do we want strike length VLS? Okay, yes, we're putting that in. Everything else is slots for Stanflex. Everything else is interchangeable slots. So, the question is kind of obvious. What do you think of it, and what do you think would happen? What do you think would happen? One of the interesting things I did see a discussion of was, with the one forums when I was looking at Stanflex, was there were apparently ideas a few years ago to try and fit the box launchers for Tomahawk to it. Nothing ever really happened with it. It was just someone's idea they put forward. I don't know if they even did any research more than just have an idea. But there are lots of ideas about what could be put on those Stanflex modules. And I am a big fan of Stanflex. I will admit that. I have looked at it for many years. I have been lucky enough to visit a couple of Danish ships in my time and see it. And I have looked at it and gone, for light frigates and small ships, this is an absolute godsend, this system. Is it perfect? No. Is it going to give you a lot of flexibility in these hulls? Massively so. And that's something which is useful. Even in larger hulls, like the Type 45 and even aircraft carriers, I could see the role of Stanflex modules being useful. For example, if you did have, let's say, close-in weapon systems and built into Stanflex modules, then you basically would just fit out your carrier, let's say the Queen Elizabeth class, we fit it out with slots for Stanflex modules. And you could go, hang on, alright, I'd like to have Sea-Scepter added on. Okay, so we put some Sea-Scepter modules up there. Or, actually, you know what, I want extra close in, I want extra guns up there, that's what I want to defend them, because that's not going to create FOD for my flight deck. Okay, so what guns are you going to go? Ooh, I think I have the 76mm and the close-in weapon systems. Oh, good choice, sir. There are options. It could have as many as 6 or even 8 slots on it that you could configure as you needed. So I think the thing is, it will be flexibility, but I think the trouble is it makes sense if you did it in the 1980s, because you could build the infrastructure and would have been in there from the get-go setting it up. So I'm not sure whether there's a point in getting into it now. But if you had joined the 1980s, considering the needs as articulated for the lighter frigates to be more easily upgradable, for them to be more survivable in terms of the auxiliaries and the support ships, for basically this not to happen again, because as good as the Annas were, it wasn't a sensible system what happened with them. Yeah. It could be very interesting. So, all that. I'd like to hear what you think. I'd like to hear what you think would have happened if the Royal Navy had gone down this route. And do you think the other nations would have joined it like I do? My view is, once you get the British involved, the odds are you get the Dutch. And once you got the British, the Dutch, and the Danish, the British, the Dutch all working together, that's going to draw in other people. It's not a case of the British lead the way. It's a case of once you've got 3 nations who are all quite known to produce good ships going a certain way, others are going to look at it. And because of the other programs that are already tied in together, you know, there's the Trilateral Frigate project, which comes out after NFR 90. There's the Horizon Frigate project, which comes after NFR 90. And there's NFR 90 itself in the 1980s. I can see it being more in terms of what happens. So, I'd really like to hear what you think. What else have we got coming up? Well, when this video comes out, it's going to be probably the Italian destroyer force. I've already written that video. I don't think I'll have recorded it before I leave for the first teaching trip, but hopefully I'll get it recorded when I get back before it goes, so it goes live when I wait a second time. Thank you very much for watching. If you like the video, please do like, share and subscribe. It really does help the channel grow, and, well, thank you. Thank you for everything you've done, and thank you for making all this possible. Toodles.